Hey guys, Ray Russell here, co-host of the Wrestling Stoop. Just a quick preface to this episode upcoming here, continuing our talk with Bob Roop on Georgia Championship Wrestling in the early 1980s, Ole Anderson ousting Jim Barnett as the man in charge, if you will. I want to be very clear about this episode of the program. We were using Ole Anderson's book as a reference guide to tell the story from this angle. Now, there may be a few, shall we say, inconsistencies between Ole's version of how things went down versus other people's stories, say Gerald Briscoe or the Dark Side of the Ring, etc., etc. Now, a lot of it very much the same, but in the deep specifics, maybe a few things are told a little differently. So for anyone listening to this episode and going, "That's not what they said on Vice," well, I am fully aware of all the different angles in which this story has been told. The takeover of Ole from Jim Barnett there in the Georgia Championship Wrestling back in the tail end of 1982 into 1983. Now, I ask you guys to remain patient. We've got more episodes on the way right around the corner. We're going to address the other versions of the story, the discrepancies, the differences in the stories. Again, there's not very many. But for all intents and purposes, this week we are basing the story off of Ole Anderson's book, Ole's version of what went down way back then. The changing of the guard, if you will, whether Barnett liked it or not, and clearly he didn't because things are a-coming, guys. No doubt about that. But for right now, guys, I want you to kick back, sit back, relax, and enjoy the latest edition of the Wrestling Stoop with the slightly under the weather, Bob Roop. Hey guys, and welcome back to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. I am your co-host, Ray Russell, along for this ride back to Georgia in the early 1980s. And the booker is one Ole Anderson. The promoter, well, that's a debate. There's a lot of guys with the hands in the cookie jar here. We're going to talk about that here this week and a whole lot more involving Jim Barnett on my boys. So in order to do that, let's bring back onto the show the one and only Mr. Bob Roop.
Oh, hey, Ray. It's good to talk to you again. And I shared with you, I'll share with our friends out there. I'm a little under the weather, but you know what? I figured if there was something that would perk up my spirits, you can't do anything about being sick or I'm recovering. But you can enhance your recovery by doing positive things. This is certainly, and for me, is a real positive. So hello again out there, and it's good to be back with you.
Yeah, we talked off air, and I told Bob, if you're not feeling too well, Bob, we can always cancel this week and, rain check for next week. And Bob said, no, if I wasn't up to this, we wouldn't be doing it. So I'm happy to say here we are, and we're going to try to do what we can this week. And we're going to continue on the Georgia story. Last week, we left you off, guys, with the story of Ole Anderson kind of starting to figure out, wait, where's my money going? Where's the stockholder money going? Something doesn't seem right here. They would draw, say, 22,000 gate, and then 17 would pop up, or a $20,000 gate and 16 would pop up. And there was a lot of money being shaved off the top, and we come to find out that there were a lot of guys taking money off the top for political reasons or whatever you may say, to go pay some people off here and there. That's the story anyway. But come to find out, they were all taking the money back to Jim Barnett for him to pay these supposed politicians and whatnot. Meanwhile, nobody was talking to anybody, and nobody realized that everybody was taking money back to Jim Barnett. He was getting money from every city on the loop.
Well, there weren't really payoffs being made. There was a payoff being made, and there was only a person who was getting that payoff. Apparently, it was Barnett. Is that your take on it?
That was Ole's take on it. I'm just going along with what he says here in his book. I haven't seen a lot of people debate that. Ole Anderson, I've heard people say, and you hear that from pretty much almost every promoter on earth, even the fair ones, that, they felt they deserved a little more, obviously. A lot of wrestlers feel that way when they got paid. But in this instance, I would say that Ole likely paid them from the gate fairly. It was just the gate wound up being less than it actually was because, if you believe the stories, Jim Barnett was essentially skimming off the top.
I'm just making a connection way back to the problems I had with Ron Fuller in Tennessee. Those house shows where I talked about where I counted, I was able to see the ticket takers and all that. Well, that's what was happening. Fuller was paying on the amount that he claimed that they made,
Right.
Rather than what they actually made. If he had been smart, he just would have. Because to make up the difference, he still would have been able to, keep a couple thousand at least in money that should have been paid to somebody, taxes or the building. He could have kept in his pocket, but he wanted to keep every nickel he could. So, and especially after you go to him or something. So, well, anyway, somebody like Ole coming after Barnett, a lot different. If I had stock in the company, for example, if I had in some way ended up with percentage of Fuller's company, I might have been able to do some of the same kind of actions myself if it had come to it. But I didn't have. The other thing that Ole had was, of course, was having a connection with Ted Turner, or at least access to him,
right?
That I didn't have. So anyway, well, you're going to be the one educating us about this part. So I'm ready and eager to listen and find out what I can find out.
Okay, so Ole does not break this down in a simple paragraph here in regards to who owned what in the stock right now of Georgia Championship Wrestling. So it took a lot of reading and a lot of math on my end to keep jotting down names and numbers and figures and things in order to get the people involved at this point in time in the early 1980s. I believe this is the full list of people who had some form of shares in the Georgia territory, and it starts with the Briscoes, Jack and Jerry. Between the two, I don't know who owned what, but Ole said Jack and Jerry together combined owned 15% of Georgia. Jim Barnett, of course, owned a small percentage, as well as Jim Barnett's friend, Jim Oates. I don't know if you're familiar with Jim Oates or if you remember that name. It's not Ted or Jerry Oates, the wrestler, but rather Jim Oates, who, the way Ole references him here in the book, may have been Barnett's companion at one point.
The name's familiar. I'm not sure if I met him or not. I'd have to see a picture.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure. I knew Barnett wasn't. He wasn't married, at least not to my knowledge. But the idea that he wouldn't have any companions, I know in Australia, Barnett was very discreet. But I knew very few people knew much about his private life. Now there might not have been a lot of people who cared about his private life or needed to know. Somebody in Ole's situation would have been more interested in what was going on behind the scenes with Barnett than I would have been, because Ole could have might have been able to use some of that information in a financial struggle, whereas I wouldn't have anywhere near that kind of interest in Barnett's personal life. But okay, where are we going next?
Well, we got a few more guys here with some percentages in the territory. The Briscoes together with 15, Barnett and Jim Oates own small percentages as well. Ole doesn't specify exactly how much, but he says Paul Jones, who was longtime promoter of the Georgia territory, just as long as Jim Barnett, before Jim Barnett, really. Paul Jones had been there forever. In fact, I believe by this point he was already 80 or something along those lines. But right. Ole simply referred to Paul Jones having a lot, and I think that's what's going to put them over the hump when we get to the part where they sell to Vince, is being able to get Paul Jones, or at least his wife, in on it, because right. I don't know that Jones was handling a lot by then. On the other end, and the reason I lumped those guys together, because those are the names you guys will listen to later when they sell to Vince McMahon. Those are the names that went along and sold the stock at just a little over 50% in order to move the company over to Vince. Meanwhile, on the other side, Ole's group, Ole said he had 10% of the stock. He bought it from Cowboy Bill Watts. Gene Anderson had 2.5%, which he bought from Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods. So the Andersons combined for about 12.5%. Ralph Freed, who was the son-in-law, I do believe, of yes. Fred Ward. And of course, Fred Ward himself owned 30%. And Fred Ward had been there for a long time as well. And so Fred Ward had a big percentage on the Ole side of the camp. And so right. we're looking at almost 50-50, but not quite. And of course, that's going to come into play later. So those are the names involved: the Briscoes, Paul Jones, Jim Barnett, Jim Oates, Fred Ward, Ralph Freed, his son-in-law, Gene and Ole Anderson. 9 people at this point in time in the early 80s all had stock in the Georgia territory. Now, that's a lot of names to own a piece of the pie.
Right. I think in a prior episode that we did, we talked about the idea that that 30% that Fred had, for example, Fred Ward,
Yeah.
was very, very important. But a lot of times when you got down to the nitty gritty, to the end thing, sometimes a person with 2 points might be the one
Yeah.
to carry the day, because without those 2 points, somebody's stuck at 49 and the other person has 51 percent. So you're 49%. You even though you own supposedly almost half the company in terms of share proxies, you don't have much say so in what's going on. The shareholder meetings were, well, remember the one that where Ray Gunkel died, and the people that had an interest in his territory got together. They decided not to invite the principal stockholder, which was Ann Gunkel, and they just said, well, we're going to start a new company. We got new shares out, and we got 100% of this one. If that's the typical way of doing business in pro wrestling, and because of the fact that these things are not written down, it's not. I don't think it was registered with the Securities and the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. I don't think that these companies were registered with them with a legal, like the Los Angeles Lakers or whatever, somebody like that.
Right.
That's $1 billion. That's a $1 billion business. Well, just about every facet, every aspect of it is covered, is being litigated somehow, to where you know what it is and what it produces and what to expect from it in terms of revenue. But that was the farthest thing from the wrestling business, was the farthest thing from that, because there was no, to my understanding. Now, maybe you're going to educate me along with everybody else in terms of what kind of organization was set up to arbitrate whose points were good, whose weren't. They certainly all had to agree on it. When they got in there and they're talking about stock, it's very fly by night. Or let's put it this way. You go from having say we're talking about the Lakers I was just talking about. Mm-hmm. If you have a shareholders meeting there, you might have 500,000 shareholders meet in a huge auditorium or coliseum someplace that could serve that number, and have a stockholders meeting where everybody gets to hear exactly what's going on, how their money is being used. The closest thing I can think to it would be with the NWA would be their annual meeting in Las Vegas, where they got together and partied for 2 or 3 days. They talked about business for maybe 5 minutes a day, and then they would share stories about what kind of bacchanal they'd all been on the night before, with booze and women and drugs and whatever. And I don't know so much about drugs, but anybody out there who's got information and knowledge about how business is supposed to be run would have to be absolutely horrified to hear the way it was run in the wrestling business, right?
Yeah, everything was wrote down on a napkin, it sounds like, right?
So. Yeah, paper bags and napkins, yeah. Yeah.
So, well, by my math here, it looks like Ole's side, the Fred Ward side here, has roughly 48 points in the territory, which would give the Barnett side 52 points. And so It's amazing how close it was, though, to it not happening, the sell to Vince McMahon, and everything that came along with that, because that's just pretty close. But like you said, it only takes, 2 or 3 points and boom, that's it. You got the war is won, and that's what's going to happen when we get to it, is the Barnett side's going to win out because there's enough guys involved there with the correct percentages to sell out to Vince McMahon, and, the rest is history there. But in order to get there, we're going to get to Ole's suspicion. We talked also, I don't want to forget last episode, I'm sure you recall this too, Bob, where Jim Barnett would go to the other major promoters and Paul Jones and Fred Ward every couple of years and say, oh, we're out of money. We need a little extra money to kick in here. And he would get them both, Jones and Ward, to give him $50,000 each. And on his word, Jim Barnett was also supposedly kicking in $50,000. And of course, they would get their money back and Jim would get a free 50, it would seem, based on Ole's version anyway.
Right. Well, it's theft, it's grand larceny, but It's brilliant because you're in a business. I mean, you couldn't get away. Even with it being $1 billion company, like back to the Lakers for a minute, I don't think it could get away with that kind of stuff without somebody being aware of it, because you couldn't be just tossing around $50,000 casually back and forth without something being people wanting to know. Well, I'm sure there was a whole company or maybe several companies full of bookkeepers taking care of the figures. Yeah, that Barnett could get away with that is not surprising at all.
Isn't it amazing that wrestling promoters in general are seen as some of the most crooked, carny people on the face of the earth, yet here we have some promoters trusting other promoters with their money? Yeah, sure, Jim, I know you're not going to do anything shady. Here's 50 grand. I don't need to see any receipts. I don't need to look into what you're doing with it. I trust you. It's so peculiar. But Jim Barnett, and Ole's going to say it here later on in the story, but he had a hell of a gimmick going here because everybody trusted him. Nobody questioned him. Nobody talked to each other about it. So he was essentially making money from everyone in this, every city, every promoter, everything. So he did have quite a racket going here, it would seem, if all of this, is true anyway, which I don't doubt that a lot of it is.
Right. And, I look at Barnett in a way, if I liken him to an element in nature, I would say Black Widow spider. That might be deceiving because that's a very fear-invoking little bitty creature like that. It can kill you, if it bites you and you can't get to help soon enough. Anyway, even if you're not killed, you're made very sick. Well, Barnett, just to set the stage a little bit, remind our friends out there that I had direct evidence of Barnett in action in Australia when it started out with my first tour there, when I was getting to know him, and he was taking me around to meet with television executives and all that. He was showing me off that, he had a wrestler that was a college graduate and an Olympian and all that sort of thing. And, I'm sure he was glad to have somebody. Now, don't get me wrong, I sound like a snob here, but I was just a stooge in a sense. I mean, I wasn't being brought in there to give a speech or anything. I was just like, I might as well have had a leash on, my pet gorilla. It was like that gorilla that they've trained to does sign language and can give, talk to you for an hour in sign language. I was like a trained gorilla, but also found out when Barnett asked me, I can't do him like you, but, Bobby, my boy, did Eddie Graham and Buddy Fuller ever say anything about me? And I don't know why. Somehow it came out. I just happened to remember that, yes, they have said something about you, Jim. I said, I don't have any idea what they're talking about. And of course I did. I was dissembling. Let's put it that way. I said, they said that you killed territories. That's about all I heard is somewhere where you worked before, you killed the territory and then you left and went somewhere else. And I said, I find it hard to believe myself. I said, I'm going to these shows over here every night and we're sold out, or great houses, and you've been doing this for years over here. And so, I find that very, very hard to believe. Well, when Barnett heard that, he got hot, and he set up the whole deal. He set up the deal where he somehow got Fuller and Graham interested in having a piece of Australia. And that was a perfect time to do it, too, because they had basically hotshot the territory for so long. And I think Barnett wanted to come back to the United States, too. His power was in the American government, not in Australia. I
think it all worked out perfectly. They wanted him back. They thought he was their savior. They called upon him. Hey, we're having trouble with Ann Gunkel. We need you to come back down here to Georgia and help us down here. So I'm sure Jim loved that. That had to feed his ego. But at the same time, like you said, Australia had been hot for so long. It was cooling down, and they were hot-shotting. Crazy stuff going on over there. And he knew it. He knew, like, all right, let's just give him everything else we got left in the tank, and then we'll get it to some sucker here before we leave town. And that's essentially
that one in Adelaide was the one that, again, just mind-boggling. It was a movie theater. It was on a main street in the city, and they fought out of the ring and up the aisle. It was a movie theater but you had that ramp, the aisle going downward towards the front, and they fought all the way up the aisle and out onto the street. And King Curtis and Mark Lewin. and they fought about half the fans came outside with them, and they're out there in the middle of the street. Lewin ran Curtis into a bus, and I mean, the bus was stopped because they were out in the people blocked the street. Lewin took Curtis and ran into the front of the bus. You talk about hot shot. What more can you do? Burn the theater down? I mean, so yeah, they had hot shot a little bit. Yeah.
For that era, that's absolutely insane. I mean, you might see things like that much later in the world of wrestling because the cameras are out there and it looks great for television. And I don't know if they're going to go stop traffic, although I can't say that they didn't a time or two. But we're talking decades later when they would pull things like that. So talk about ahead of the time. King Curtis and Mark Lewin. I'm not really surprised with the guys involved, but
I was just trying to make a reference to Barnett and his ability to get revenge.
I got you.
And when he found out that when Ole took the cash register or the money printing apparatus that print money that Barnett had control of, he took it away from him. You know, it wasn't just a financial loss. It was a loss in stature too, because here was this guy, you know, who's 140 or 50 pounds, was very diminutive, and he didn't look strong enough to snap a pencil. And he always looked great, but he was small, very effeminate, and acted in a very effeminate way. And here he is giving orders to great big guys like Brute Bernard and Skull Murphy and Andre the Giant. I don't mean ordering them around like a slave master, but telling them what to do. And he was their boss. So that had to be the height of, especially among his colleagues in the gay world, that he had to have a lot of stature, that he had attained this position where he was able to be the visible face of the company. A lot of times, someone in that situation would be kind of a behind-the-scenes person, but Barnett loved he loved the power that he had with that, because power is very addictive. So I was just trying to make a reference to now Barnett's going to apply that same venom once Ole made the switch that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry. Let's go ahead and go on with that.
Yeah, I got plenty to get into here. So chapter 31 in Ole's book is titled Power Play, and it is a power play made by Ole Anderson towards Jim Barnett, and the story starts like this. The question Fred Ward had was, did Barnett ever put any money into the pot himself? And that is in reference to what we were just talking about when he would go to Fred Ward and Paul Jones and ask for $50,000 apiece and then say, I'll put 50 in as well. And Fred Ward basically asking Ole Anderson, do you think Barnett's even putting that $50,000 in? So now even the other promoters beginning to be a little curious as to what's going on. Ole then says, I can't stress it enough when I say that we, Ronnie West, Charlie Smith, Bobby Simmons, Charlie Harbin, myself, and who knows who else, were delivering a lot of money to Jim Barnett from the towns. I can't swear to what the money was being used for. Supposedly it was being used for payoffs, politicians, commissioners, or whatever. What I do wonder is if it ever made its way to the corporate accounts or if the stockholders ever received any part of that money. I do know that people used to ask me, years later, why Jim Barnett was given such free reign over the corporate cash. The answer is simple. Nobody was about to ask Jim Barnett because they all saw him as a multi-millionaire and the boss. Nobody had the guts to even question him about it. He was able to run the company any way he wanted to run it. In addition, neither the NWA nor Georgia Championship Wrestling had any system of checks and balances. Imagine that. Fred Ward once told me, Jim Barnett has created one of the best gimmicks ever in the wrestling business. Talking about the scam that he's got going on here. Right. The shareholders let Barnett run the business, and that being the case, nobody questioned Jim Barnett about the financial transactions of the company. And that's kind of where it starts to, everything's starting to fall into place now. Ole speculating, Fred Ward speculating. These are guys on the other side, right, of the people that didn't want to sell the stocks to Vince McMahon. And they're the ones that are starting to feel like something else is going on here in regards to some of this money. It just doesn't make sense financially. Ole goes on, and this is where you talked about revenge or maybe kind of planting seeds. This is according to Ole, of course, but he talks about some other issues. He says, Other problems began to crop up during this time. Vince McMahon was beginning to get upset about us promoting in his backyard. They were expanding into other cities in Pennsylvania and whatnot. Ole said, I was concerned that Barnett was pushing me to expand into Vince's territory so that he could say to Vince, basically lay the blame on Ole, put it on his shoulders, and to Vince or any other promoter that may get upset. And he said Barnett would pass the buck a few times, saying things like, well, you know how difficult Ole can be. So basically Barnett encouraging Ole to go run towns that may not necessarily be in his territory, if you will, and then turning around when the promoters are getting upset. And Jim's the one going, well, you know, I'd love to try to tell Ole otherwise, but he's so damn stubborn.
Barnett was, and again, in a business, everybody was secretive. There was nobody nobody was examining books, and financial ledgers. There weren't any checks being made. So,
right.
The paper bag thing of carrying money around in a paper bag, that was typical of the business. I'm not a bit surprised that I'm picturing Barnett having the personal lifestyle of a multimillionaire, of going out. I mean, think about it, he's getting every night he's getting at least several hundred, maybe $1,000, $2,000. Well, he could go out. He could go to the most expensive places in town, wherever it was at, and order the best wine and the best dinner and all that, and have guests and treat them to the wine and the food. Sure. He could be the host, and also he had that position as a advisor of some sort with the United States Department of Art and Commerce. So here he is officially plugged in, and then he's throwing the money around. So it wasn't just the boys, as all of his associates probably figured he was a millionaire too, the way he could spend money like that. So yeah, I can just see him in his heyday, just having the greatest life imaginable. He gets to tell all these great big burly tough wrestlers what to do, and then he can go out and tell all his friends about it and laugh at the wrestler. If any of his friends were in on his practices, actually how he was getting that money, he would be laughing about that too.
Well, I see this too as Jim Barnett may be taking this cash off the top and supposedly using it on the politicians, and maybe he is. I'm sure they're getting something out of this, but like you're saying, maybe not just donations and things of that nature, even though I'm sure that was involved in many instances, but he's taking them out to these glorious dinners, these lobster dinners and these champagnes. Yep. So he's not just, he's smoozing them, right? So that's how he's getting in with them. So yes, indeed, Ole, he is paying for the politicians. He's just doing it in a different way. It's getting him over at the same time as, as Georgia Championship Wrestling's basically footing the bill is the way it plays here. It's kind of that no checks and balances deal is kind of a double-edged sword for the promoters, because they got to love that on one end, because it's like, dude, we can report whatever we want to the IRS and yada, yada. But on the other end, it's like, well, we don't really have any proof that any of this exists, so anybody can come and take it. So you're kind of screwed in that. It's like, it's very shady, I guess, at the end of the day is what I'm trying to say.
Oh my God. What kind of business could it be? Go back to the Gunkel situation for a minute. That was $1 million business. And the founder dies, or one of the major stockholders die, and all of a sudden people can get together and say, oh, well, hey, guess what?
It just
that $1 million company over there, we're going to just take that.
Yeah.
Because when you buy a wrestling company, all you usually buy, the sucker who buys it, usually all they really get tangible is a wrestling ring. Nothing else. Everything else, all the TV contracts or situations and all that, most of them are personal in some way. And so if you're not figured in and you aren't given the okay as a new owner by the TV people and all the movers and shakers, you're stuck. You're not going to be able to make it as a promoter. So yeah, I think Barnett was walking a fine line where he wouldn't say that, oh yeah, it's Georgia Championship Wrestling taking you out. He wouldn't even say that. I doubt very seriously he would claim to be the just he was treating everybody to dinner on his own merit, not on behalf of the company. That would be why Jim had so much clout. I mean, how did he originally get that place in the government? It had to be for Mako. I talked about it in another program. making political donations to people who went on to become senators or congressmen. That's one way to get yourself. A lot of the ambassadors to foreign countries, when a new administration comes in the presidency, you get a new president, you get a lot of new ambassadors too, and a lot of them are people who have no knowledge or ability at all at being an ambassador, but they contribute a couple $1 million to the campaign.
Yeah.
So they go over there and they're the ambassador, and a lot of times they're just a figurehead. They have the administrative staff is the one that's running, and they're still in place. They don't leave. You just get a new ambassador. So you can buy your way in there is what I'm saying. And I think that's how Barnett did it too. But he was bought in. He did get his ticket. When I saw him especially looking at being from wrestling, I thought that was his main claim to fame. When I saw him on the reviewing stand at the presidential swearing in, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was a fake. I thought it's got to be a trick shoot, but it wasn't. He had that clout. So anyway, yeah, he was a master deceiver.
So now he's trying to get Ole some heat with the other promoters, at least in Ole's eyes. Hey, let's start running Erie. Let's start running here. Let's start running just outside of our boundaries and see what happens here. And then, according to Ole, he feels like Barnett was going back and saying, oh, that was Ole's idea, and he's not going to listen to me. I can try to talk him out of it, but that was on Ole. And so Anderson here in his book says, I knew that when it finally got to the point where the promoters were really upset with us for running into their cities, he simply was going to say, well, I'll just have to let Ole go. And so basically he's saying Barnett would fire Ole Anderson as booker or having any kind of control because he's pissing all of these other promoters off and he wants to keep the other promoters happy. But then Ole's fearing, I won't be able to get a job anywhere because these people think that I was the asshole trying to run their towns. So that's basically what he calls the last straw. Is if I get fired here, I won't even have a job anywhere. I need to put a kibosh on this, is basically what Ole's saying. And that's when he decides, that's it. We're going to do something about this before it gets completely out of control. And so he says, in the last week of December 1982, Ralph Freed and I went over to Barnett's apartment. I did all the talking while Ralph acted like he didn't know what was going on. I laid it out to Barnett in simple terms. You owe me 20 grand and I want it. The company owes a lot of money, too, because you're running the company into the toilet. We had serious debt. The company owed a lot of money to television stations, newspapers, and radio stations. I said, there's going to be a change. We're going to call a stockholders meeting and there will be a vote. I'm going to be elected chairman and president of Georgia Championship Wrestling, and I am going to run the company. So Ole comes in there and tells him there's going to be a vote, and I'm going to win. I'm going to win this vote, Jim Barnett. He says, you can tell people anything you want to tell them because I'm not going to tell anybody other than the stockholders. You can tell everybody you're the president of Georgia Championship Wrestling, kind of stroking his ego there. So basically saying, I'm taking over. The stockholders are going to know all about it because we're going to vote on this and we're going to get it done. But you can tell anybody else. You can walk around and with your head held high and tell everybody else you're still in charge. I don't care about that. Ole Anderson wasn't one to peacock. He was just trying to get the business done here. So he comes in and matter-of-factly tells Jim Barnett, you are no longer going to be in control.
Wow. Well, that had to be a really unwelcome surprise. But it sounds to me like Barnett wouldn't be surprised by that. I think when Ole first started, the first time he ever started making or asking questions about the money, Barnett saw him as a potential threat. Anybody that would step forward and say, hey, well, I mean, I can just hear the chills going up and down Barnett's spine when, say, some stooge came in there and said, hey, Mr. Barnett, so-and-so Ole Anderson was asking me about something about the money. I can just see Barnett's spine curdling, especially with it being Ole. He couldn't control Ole. A lot of guys he could control because he did have that thing that you mentioned earlier. He did pose as a millionaire, and you're dealing with someone who's got millions of dollars of personal money, who's got all kinds of attorneys that can sue you for any reason he feels like if he wants to, even if it's totally groundless and has no basis in fact. They can tie you up in court and with attorney's fees for the rest of your life. It's a lot of power. Ole had to be Barnett's absolute worst nightmare because Ole wasn't afraid of him.
Let's remember, too, at this point, Ole still presumes that Jim Barnett is the millionaire, the multimillionaire that he seems to be. So this is before Ole comes to the deduction, thanks to some conversations with Vern Gagne and some other guys, that, oh, maybe this guy isn't everything he's pretending to be out here. And so Ole goes on with his story here with Jim Barnett. He says, "You can tell them you're the chief executive officer. Tell them whatever you want. I really don't care. The only thing you won't be able to do is write a check or have free access to any of the money. Hey, you've got millions of dollars, Jim Barnett, so you can live on those millions of dollars. Right now, we need every single dollar that we can lay our hands on in order to keep Georgia Championship Wrestling around, keeping GCW, helping it survive, basically." He says, "That was exactly how it all went down. Barnett didn't like it, of course. I don't know if my final statement had anything to do with his decision, but it may have played a small part. You don't have to accept those terms, Jim, but if you don't, I'm going to dump you over the balcony railing." Okay, so of course at that time I was kidding, but now, years later, I wonder why I didn't. When the afternoon of the meeting rolled around, the stockholders were all aware of the situation. I had a lot of conversations with the Briscoes, Ralph, Fred, and Gene prior to the meeting. The only stockholder who didn't know about it ahead of time was Jim Oates, Barnett's Pookie pal. And we'll leave it at that. So basically they hold the stockholders meeting and they have the conversation, and I guess Ole's elected in, but I do love that he said, "I don't know if my final comment when they went over to Jim's house had anything to do with him going along with it," but apparently Ole threatened to maybe hang him out of his window or toss him out of his window.
Right. Well, I'm sure Barnett would pick up on that because the Ole could even make that threat or even allude to it, show that he wasn't in any way intimidated, that Barnett's apparent stature, whether it be based on money, connections, or all of the above, that Ole wasn't bothered by that, or in spite of that, it didn't matter how rich you are. If somebody drops a couple stories on your head out of a window, you can be as rich as you can be. You're still going to be either dead or crippled. It's like having that story about you have a wall holding back the water and somebody's plugging a leak. Once that Ole pulled the kid's finger out of the dam, and Barnett could see that if he went, I'm speculating here, I'll just make it quick. If Barnett saw that in order to defend himself, he was going to have to show what he did with the money. Ole had a way of finding out basically how much money Barnett had been taking. Ole had been one of the bagmen himself, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so he could get all the other bagmen together and kind of figure out, well, the last year or 6 months or whatever, Barnett's taken, say $150,000 off the top, and then plus the thing with Fred and Paul, the 50 grand alone just from them. So make it $250,000, say, a year. He's taken off. Now what did you do with it? Who did you pay? If nothing else, show us on your taxes. You would certainly deduct it from your taxes. Show us. There's some record somewhere of where you spent that money.
Yeah.
Well, Barnett probably didn't have any. I mean, he didn't have enough to cover it all.
Well, this was free money. They were taking money. They weren't claiming the money. I mean, he could do whatever he wanted with it. Absolutely. So, I'm 100% behind you there. That wasn't going to make the taxes.
Right. No, they treated the IRS out of so much money. Fuller over there in Tennessee, and I mean all of them.
Yeah, all of them, obviously.
Yeah, all of them. I don't know. Paul Jones. I think Paul Jones was probably honest.
Paul Bosch, you mean?
Paul Bosch. Okay. Sorry. Thank you for correcting me. Yeah, I think he was honest. I know he paid honestly. So I have to think if he paid based on what the house really was, either you're honest or you aren't. If you lie one time in your entire life, I'm sorry to say, even if you've never told another lie, you're a liar, even if you only did it one time in your life.
Yeah. And
so I think Paul earned the reputation he had by being honest, and he certainly gave the appearance of it because he's a man who obviously respected himself. And I never saw that with many other promoters that they showed respect for
No,
themselves.
I don't know if you know this, but when Paul Bosch died around 1989 or so, President Bush was in the office, and him being from Texas as well, I don't know what their friendship was, but he actually sent a presser to the funeral of Paul Bosch. And even if it's your friend and you're the president of the United States, you may not have time to really, dive into something like that. But that just shows you, how far up Paul Bosch went in the world of Texas as well, right? So if Bush knew him to some degree, enough to send a letter, expressing sorrow and whatnot. So Paul Bosch definitely had some people, I don't want to say in his pocket, like Jim Barnett here,
not at all.
But, certainly people that respected him higher up. So it's a different way to make it to the top.
Well, he might have donated money to his campaign,
sure,
but he would have put it on his income tax too. It wasn't anything. He wasn't anything. You know what? It's hard for me to believe that Paul was duplicitous. I didn't know him that well. I was only around him 3 or 4 times, but the first time we sat for a half hour and talked, and he just came across all my instincts, and to this day, was that he was a decent, honest person.
Okay.
That's a rarity in the business we were in. With all this money flying around, in paper bags. Yeah, it was hard not to be tempted. I can take this $10,000 and nobody's going to know? Yeah, all you got to do is keep your mouth shut. Here, it's in this paper bag. Put it in your back pocket. I think Paul was on the up and up.
Well, we have come to the conclusion that maybe Jim Barnett was not. So this is how it all goes down. They have the stockholder meeting, and Ole comes in there, and he's going to represent the stockholders by going up and saying that I told them we were in trouble financially and that Jim Barnett was the one bleeding the company dry. He said this right in front of Jim, by the way. We had a stockholder meeting, and Barnett made the announcement. Barnett conceded. Ole will be running the corporation, and he will be the president. 2 days later, our new arrangement was finalized. So just like that, Ole comes into somebody's house and says, I'm taking over. This is a guy who had all the power, all the money. Everybody was paying him money. I mean, just tons and tons of money was coming, siphoned. It's insane how much money's involved in this. And it only takes one guy to come in and say, I'm on to you. And you can't imagine how much he was taking for him to just go, oh shit, the jig's up. All right, you got it. I mean, it only took somebody to come in and call him out. And within a matter of days, he's just no longer in power of any kind. So that's just insane to think about how quickly it went.
Barnett knew how to withdraw. I mean, there's ways you win war. The Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, actually, one of the most strategic moves he made was a retreat, because he got Napoleon to follow him into an ambush that basically turned the battle and won the battle for the free world, because that was going to be, if Napoleon had won, then England was going to be subservient to him too. He would have had an empire. But yeah, the thing is, the dread that Ole brought with him was the idea that if he ever mentioned, we want to take a look at the books of where all this money's going, that would have to be Barnett's absolute nightmare, because what he was doing was grand theft larceny. Felonious to the point of a lot of times your sentencing at trial is based on how much money you stole. And Barnett might have stole $500,000 or more in that time he was in there. Who knows? I mean, that's not a ludicrous figure with him.
No, not at all. In fact, I would say you're being generous. It could be quite a bit more, honestly, based on what Ole's. Now it depends on when Ole or Barnett would have started this specific scheme. I don't know what he was doing up until, it dawns on you upon time. You might try it out in this city, try it out in another city, and then it expands. And of course, Ole then expands into Ohio and whatnot. It sounds to me like Jim started taking those towns pretty quickly. But here's what's funny about this whole thing. So Jim gets called out, and he passes the buck, or he passes the promotion over to Ole. Ole's the new corporation president. He's handling everything from this moment forward. And then Ole says, within that same week, Barnett called, wanting to meet me for lunch. And as we ate, he told me that at the very least, he wanted to continue drawing his salary. Now, up to that time, he had been getting what was referred to as a pittance of a salary, $1,500 a week. I thought that was interesting. Barnett was a multi-millionaire, but he still felt it was important to take a little something from Georgia Championship Wrestling. His reasoning was, how will it look if I'm not drawing a salary? It just looks funny if the president of GCW doesn't make at least $1,500 a week. I laid it on the line. I'm not going to pay you because we need the money to pay our bills, Jim. A few days later, he comes back to me and said he would be willing to settle for $500 a week. I said, Jim, you have millions of dollars. What's $500 to you? So it starts off Jim Barnett basically owning the world. He's trying to settle for, how would it look if the president didn't get paid? I don't really need the $1,500, but I don't want it to be suspicious. So Ole, why don't you just give me $1,500? We'll call it even every week. And Ole says, we need this for the company. And Jim says, all right, how about $5? And Ole not budging anywhere here, but just a hell of a story here. Jim Barnett is quickly deflating here as a promoter.
Wow. That's just mind-boggling. Although, he doesn't sound like a millionaire, does he? The question is, again, where did all the money that he took, where did it go? What was he spending on? His personal life he kept very personal. He was very discreet. Really curious of where he spent all the money he stole. Because for him to be able to come back after, figure that year before he got ousted, say he took $300,000 off the top. Mm-hmm. And I'm going real low. Well, let's see, 350, 52, about 6,000 a week. 300,000 wouldn't be out of, would it?
No, I don't think so.
No. Well, how would you spend all that money? How would you spend that much money?
I mean, and do the math, guys. We're talking 300,000 in early 80s money. That's over $1 million today.
Yeah. How would you spend it? I mean, what do you do? Buy jewelry? What do you buy?
Well, I'm sure we'll get into that because Ole does break down some of the things that that Jim Barnett would have. That would kind of make sense then. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know where it's at here in my notes. So hopefully we do get to it here.
We'll get to it.
I tried to get everything in order here and sorted. So hopefully it's where it needs to be in the story here. But imagine this, Bob. He says, once I cut Jim Barnett off from the expense fund, the money suddenly began to accumulate, and I paid off the company debts in less than 6 months. So by the middle of 1983, Ole had paid off all the Georgia debts, he says. It must have been at that point that Jim decided to work a deal with Vince McMahon, Jr., that is, to see if he could get hired over there. I mean, it falls in line. Now, the deal with Vince is not going to happen until 1984, but it certainly didn't come up over a week's time. So I'm sure Jim Barnett planted the seeds once he realized, I'm not going to be able to live off this anymore. Not the way I used to anyway.
Right.
Hey, it's Bob Smith, and guess what? The Outdated Wrestling Hour is now part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. But hey, no fear, you're still going to hear the unique guests, comedy, music, authors, journalists, funny people. Who knows who's going to end up on the Outdated Wrestling Hour? Remember, it's all new and all old. So check it out in the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and wherever you get your podcasts. Listen if you know what's good for you.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. But that's not all. You can also check out the Pro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Pro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron over at Patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, Patreon.com patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of The Grenade Show, Regional Wrestling, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive Watch Along series covering mini past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, Videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. No subscription, cancel anytime. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia podcast network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com, and to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
Yeah, that was, I don't know what he was doing. That would be interesting. I don't know if Ole had access to that too, that he put in his book, but imagine going from having, well, let's say, again, a low estimate of $10,000 a week in cash, dark money, the paper bag type, that you can just reach in the bag, and as long as it's, the thing is, it's a bag that's got two openings, one that you take from and the one that put the money in, because you take some out, maybe later that day, there's more going in. Come another town, people came back with a payoff for you. So I'm just curious again how he managed to spend all that money. Maybe Ole will tell us.
Well, I do see it. Yeah, he's going to, because I see it coming here very shortly. So,
okay.
Basically, Ole speculating that this may have been around the time that Jim Barnett might have been starting to work in with Vince McMahon Jr. and the WWF. But at the time, Ole says, I didn't realize that all the stories about Jim Barnett being a multimillionaire were complete fabrications. I believe them all. I think Ralph believed them. Jack and Jerry Briscoe believed them. Everyone believed them. The only person who knew the stories weren't true was Vern Gagne. Years later, when I talked to Vern, I mentioned something about Barnett being a millionaire. Vern looked at me in amazement. So he's still telling that story? Vern started in Chicago back in the 1940s with Fred Kohler, the old promoter who ran Chicago Wrestling on the Dumont Network. Jim Barnett was initially his right-hand man, for those who don't know. And so Vern knew Jim Barnett before he was anything in the wrestling business. So Vern knew before anyone else that some of this, or a lot of this, may have been a charade from the beginning in regards to Jim Barnett, but not his lifestyle. Ole said Barnett absolutely lived a high lifestyle. And you asked, Bob, where did all this money go? Well, Ole says that Jim Barnett had an apartment in downtown Atlanta, a high-rise. He had a chauffeur who was a black kid who wore a uniform and drove him around in his Rolls Royce. So this wasn't a limo, like where you're renting the limo and the guy's going to come pick you up and drop you off, and you might see him, at the end of the day. This was Jim Barnett purchasing a Rolls Royce and keeping this kid on payroll. He probably sat in the car all day to drive Jim wherever he wanted to go. So that's just one of the many things. He says Jim Barnett had his own cook and his own maid. So he was on, he had a lot of shit going on, right? So that's, you want to know where the money went. He's hiring people talk about trying to live like a millionaire.
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go. That's all that is expensive. And the fact that Vern Gagne was the only one that knew about it is also surprising. Yeah, I'm not a bit surprised, though, to find out that he wasn't from money. He came into it.
Oh, did he ever? I mean, he found a way to have a maid and a cook. It was, I could see living lavishly, right? You got a nice car, you're living in a nice penthouse. Okay, I get that. But you go so far as to, I need my own maid, I need my own cook. I need a guy who just sits in a car all day driving me around from town to town or wherever I want to go. I mean, that's insane. Talk about, payroll. He's got his own payroll that has nothing to do. The stockholders are paying for Jim Barnett's home payroll, basically, is what's happening here. It sounds like to me. So Ole says Jim Barnett was a pretty big figure. He was on several boards in Atlanta, the hospital board, the arts council. He was well connected, so well connected that you can see him standing on the stage, as we talked about, at the presidential election. And yet at the same time, I was loaning Barnett as much as $20,000 at a stroke. I still have a note for $20,000 that he owes me. So even when he was writing this book, Ole still had a note somewhere of money owed from Jim Barnett. He said most of the time the loans he asked me were pretty small, $2,000, $5,000, but adding them all together, it amounted to a lot of money. And I found out later that he was also borrowing money from other people. And even though he was constantly borrowing money from other people, I still thought he was a multi-millionaire. Eventually, each time I loaned him the money, I would ask, why do you need this money when you have millions of dollars, Jim? Jim would always reply, Ole, cash is hard to come by because everything is all tied up in my stocks and bonds. Mm-hmm. All I need is $10,000 in cash to give some of the politicians. So basically, Jim Barnett creating reasons why everything's tied up in stocks and bonds. I love it.
He might have had a hot date that night or something. He needed to impress, the limo, the Rolls Royce, and take him to dinner at the Penthouse restaurant on, down in the middle of Atlanta, to be seen and respected and all that by the movers and shakers. That was a company he moved in. And, you're starting to explain where the money's going. It's hard for me to believe that he was able to garner these connections based on his personality alone. Although he was educated, he could talk to you, he could discuss things, and he was artistically educated. He could come across as being someone of class, especially if he's throwing money around. Yeah, the money was like a suit of armor for him because he could have a barriers, for example, having his own maid, his own cook, and not having to worry about someone, because, those people are going to be privy to his personal life, whether he has guests, at night or whatever, people who have an opportunity to see the inner circle, so to speak. All that took money. So, it's starting to come clear where his money was going. First of all, he was throwing it around. He didn't seem to care.
Well, when it's a constant flow, you don't really have to have those worries. And now that it's no longer a flow, he's trying to hit Ole up for a measly $1,500 back in early 80s money, by the way, guys, a week. And then he breaks down to $5, and Ole's not budging, but he would still come in from time to time and ask for X amount of dollars for a politician, and Ole would agree. He didn't realize Barnett was going around doing this to various people at the same time. And so he was still finding ways to grab a buck here and there. Ole said, how could I refuse to give him the money? It seemed feasible. He was allowing me to have a salary of $2,400 a week, main event money on top of that. And eventually I got 5% of Michigan, 3% of Atlanta, and 5% of Augusta, did Ole. So with all these big things going on, Ole's making all this money. How can Jim Barnett be all bad? So, all right, I guess I believe him. He needs this money here. So here you go. So Barnett's still finding ways to nickel and dime himself into lavish lifestyle, it would appear. He said everybody was of the opinion that Barnett was a multimillionaire. As such, they felt that he was untouchable. He ran the company the way he wanted to, and nobody ever questioned it. Ralph and Fred Ward, were the only people who might have had a reason to question it. But they were dependent on the book in Atlanta to help their towns draw. In addition to that, Barnett was smart enough to give the stockholders rather decent dividends from time to time when excess money was available. So Barnett was smart enough to keep people fed, so to speak, when the time was right. They seem to be getting a little antsy. Let me toss them a little money and they'll stop questioning me here. But that's another good point in regards to Fred Ward, who owned his own towns, is that they were using Georgia TV. They were using TBS to promote those towns. They were using the talent from the Atlanta territory. So Fred Ward couldn't really, just with part of the stocks, he really couldn't rattle the boat too much at this point.
Well, I don't know if I got the information, or maybe I need more information. He asked Fred Ward and Paul Jones for $50,000 each, and then eventually he ended up giving them the money back.
Correct.
That's a big payment, but it's basically their own money he's given back.
Right. And meanwhile, their money that they gave him, let's just look at it like this, Bob. If I went and asked you for $50,000 and someone else for $50,000, and I claimed I was also putting $50,000 into something, and I take this and I go and I purchase something that cost $100,000, and then I take that property and I sell it for $150,000, and I give you guys your money back, I get to keep $50,000, and I did absolutely nothing. And that's kind of what Jim Barnett was doing, according to Ole anyway. And everybody just assumes that, well, he bought in, or at least, well, initially they thought that he was buying into the whole situation, and come to find out, likely not. And again, hell of a racket. Kudos to that. I guess I have to admire that in some degree, although I don't know that it's the most moral thing in the world. But hey, man, I guess if it gets you paid, whatever.
It's the best business in the world to steal from. I know the mafia might be better, but I remember a picture I saw of Giant Baba was lighting a cigar with $100 bill, and I thought, oh man, I said, he had a TV company that he didn't own it, but he was making, I don't know, millions, I think, a year.
Sure.
And money just meant nothing. And that again is like indicative of the wrestling business. It's like I always said money for nothing in a sense, because of the fact that that was wrong. It was incorrect, because the fans were getting something for their buck. It's like if you go see a great movie, it didn't really say it's made up, it's not a real story, but still you were immensely moved by it. It was a great movie to see. You're not going to go and say, oh, well, wait a minute, I found that's not all true, so now I hate it. No, you were turned on by it, or you were say it was The Shining or some horror movie that The Exorcist or something that scared the crap out of you, and none of that's actually happened or hadn't been seen. But in the wrestling business, it was just wide open for loose money. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, the jig is finally up here, and Ole essentially going to find out for himself. It is a matter of fact, at least according to Jim Barnett himself, he was never a millionaire, it would appear. At least that's the way the story goes. As Ole states, I mentioned earlier, the last time that Jim Barnett borrowed money from me, he asked for $20,000. It was supposed to be for a city councilman who had strong political connections in Atlanta. I gave Jim the $20,000 in cash. As I said earlier, he never paid me back. Years later, I sued him for it. I showed my attorney the note that Barnett had written out and signed, and I asked my attorney, is this note worth anything? My attorney replied, yeah, he owes you $20,000. I perked right up. Great. How can we collect it? He went right on the offensive. We'll file a lawsuit immediately. He'll have 30 days to answer the suit. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I asked him, what will we do if he doesn't answer it? Then we'll get a judgment, he said. If we have to, we'll go to his apartment or whatever the case may be, anything that he has of value. And if we have to, we'll take the paintings off his wall. So basically, Ole coming for that $20,000. He wasn't going to be. I decided that it was worth pursuing. So I told my attorney, fine, go ahead and get things rolling. That's what they did. When 30 days passed, I called my attorney and asked him if he had received the answer from Barnett. My attorney's reply, he hasn't addressed the lawsuit. We gave him a 15-day extension. I thought I was hearing things. Why would you give him an extension? He gave me the typical pass-the-buck lawyer double talk. Well, It's a courtesy. That's the common practice. They also get a little more money out of Ole that way. Bear in mind, just 30 days before that, he told me he would go for a judgment if we didn't get a response. Anyway, 15 days later, Barnett's attorney responded to the lawsuit, which put it into legal mode. He set it up so that we could now go on for the next 3,000 years. Of course, the next stop was to call Barnett in and take his deposition. I still have a copy of that deposition. Barnett was asked the question, were you ever a millionaire? His response, oh no, I was never a millionaire. Barnett would do clever things. He would be on the phone in his office with the door closed. Sometimes during the day, he would get up and go out, leaving the office unguarded and unlocked. Doug Smith, I'm not familiar with him, would walk in and then he would walk out. "Hey, Ole, come look at this," Doug would claim. Barnett had accidentally left a note on his notepad. Doug picked up the pad of paper and read the words out loud. Barnett had written, "Sell 20,000 shares of AT&T, $4.75 per share." He had notes strewn around his office that referred to huge transactions that amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. In my opinion, it was all bogus. He created fictitious notes up and casually left them on his desk for people to find. No, Jim Barnett was never a millionaire, but he was riding in a chauffeured Rolls Royce, had a maid, and an apartment in Atlanta's high-rent district, all courtesy of Georgia Championship Wrestling.
Oh, my God. What a life Barnett was leading. It was all an act, and he was getting paid handsomely. He was paying himself handsomely to be the star of his show. He was the one that created it. He didn't ask any of the other people if they wanted to play their part. He conned them into it. The guy was brilliant. Let's face it.
Leaving the notes around so that when you walk in the room, that is the pinnacle, the ultimate con man. To think that deeply. Oh, they'll just walk in and see these notes, and I'll look like I am a millionaire. And that's right. And the money they were making in Australia, I want to be clear, at some point Barnett had to have been a millionaire, but at the same time, you have to actually save that money. And the way he was spending it, I don't know how long he was a millionaire. I don't know how long he kept that status. At times, I'm sure he definitely toyed with that level of money in his bank accounts. But at the same time, likely not by the 1980s. And it's just unbelievable that he would go in there and write these share notes and things of that nature. It's crazy to go to that level. That is an ultimate con man.
Yeah, well, the think about it, he was juggling in the sense that I'm not going to say it was a house of cards, but in a sense it was, because of the way that eventually the house of cards fell down was when Ole removed himself from support and actually went in and toppled the rest of the cards by saying, we're going to do this and I'm going to take over. Then it all came down at once. For the time that, I don't know how long he was there, years.
Barnett
Yeah, Barnett.
He came back during the Georgia War, so he'd probably about 10 years at this point.
Wow. Imagine the amount of money he took out in that time.
Yeah, 10 years is a long time to be running the show. And remember, they called upon Jim. It was trusty Jim. Jim, we need your help. Ann Gunkel's kind of kicking our ass over here. We need a little boost. And Jim Barnett comes back. So he was asked to return. It wasn't like he weaseled his way back into the territory.
Well, he was smart that way. He played the role of the guy who was connected. He played that to he should have gotten an Oscar. He played that role so well. And he did have connections. Now, I'm not saying he had power or leverage, but he had people that he did know people in government and in administration. These are the people he was whining and dining. I think some of them anyway. And some of it would be his personal life. But what a fun time he must have had going around and living the life of a millionaire for, 10 years there in Atlanta. I'm sure he didn't start out as strongly as he ended up at the end there, where he was, he was getting money from every town every night. I'm sure he didn't start out that way. Although he might have, I don't know. Yeah, what a story. What a story. What a con man he was.
Well, the promotion continues on, and we're not done with Jim Barnett necessarily. Obviously, he's going to be part of the sell job to Vince, but there's some other things going on here, and we're moving into the later half of 1983 now. This is well after Ole had taken over control of the company. He said, by late 83, we were playing a new ball game. That was when the crap really started to hit the fan. It was a ball-busting time for me. I was facing opposition from people who should have been helping me build our business. Jim Barnett, the Briscoes, and Paul Jones' wife. I even had to fight the management at the TV station. They assigned a girl to us to review our TV program before we went on the air. She was a heavy-set, repulsive bitch. We called her Land Rover. My God. Do you remember Land Rover, Bob? I got to ask you.
No, I remember a female who was fairly prominent. She had to do with pay-per-views, and she was... but she was attractive. She wasn't a Land Rover.
Oh, no, I know who you're referring to. No, this would be this is long before pay-per-view. This is early 80s Georgia. So this is somebody working for the company. Not Georgia, but for TBS, I guess is what it is. they hire this, higher up executive sort of person here at TBS. And apparently she was a heavy-set, repulsive bitch named Land Rover. At least that's what Ole called her. He said, we never took her suggestions, but I had to meet with her once a week just to placate her. On her first week, she asked to review our script. Well, as soon as we write one, I'll personally hand you a copy. A script, All right. We never wrote a script, so she never got one. So she called and said, I want to know what you're going to do on TV this week. I said, I can give you a list of the wrestlers who are scheduled to appear on TV. I can't guarantee that they'll all be there because if somebody gets hurt the week before, they might not make the TV. But other than giving you a list of who's supposed to be there and what matchups there are, I don't have anything else to give you. So Ole, not going to break kayfabe. This lady wants a fucking script, Bob. Which there may be a layout sheet, right, of what you're going to do to a degree. I mean, you're still not going to break kayfabe on that back then either. But at the same time, this lady's wanting a full-ass script back in 1983. I want to know what you guys are going to do.
I wonder if she was talking to him on the phone. It wouldn't matter. She could have a tape recorder in her purse. And here you get the president of the company to explain how they're going to be telling everybody what to do on TV that day. And then next day it's on, it's on international news. Ole wasn't never going to do anything. That's stupid.
Well, it's funny because she didn't let him off easy. He said, he says, she didn't let me off that easily. She said, come on, you have to give me some kind of outline of what you're planning to do on TV this week. Ole responded, well, the first match is going to have a 10-minute time limit. We might not have a winner if it goes to 10 minutes. If it goes less than 10 minutes, then we'll have to come up with something else to fill the rest of the time. I don't have any idea what that's going to be yet, but I won't worry about it until it happens. She went ballistic. She wasn't breaking, according to Ole here. Like she knew that this was not on the up and up, but Ole going to play this thing right to the end.
Oh yeah. Oh, he was kayfabing her, and she didn't like it. She wanted, I'm sure that she probably looked at the wrestlers as being
below her,
below her. Yeah, I said beneath, but right. Below her, and that the fact that this crew and Ole came across. Sometimes Ole came across like he wasn't all educated because he didn't have manners all the time. He wasn't diplomatic a lot of times in the way he talked to people. He would cut all the BS out, and what would normally take a 5-minute conversation, he could get done in about 20 seconds by cutting out all the BS. So a lot of people didn't like hearing that. But the thing is, Ole was so smart. He really was very, very bright that he could deal with all that. No matter what it was, he had a way of dealing with it, and he sure wasn't going to expose the business to someone he didn't have any confidence in.
Yeah, well, this lady cracks me up. I mean, the way he described her, obviously, it's as only Ole can do, and then obviously she's not laying off the thing. So Ole said, I did my best to make her believe that the show and the matches were spontaneous. Once in a while, she would take me aside when the show was over and tell me what she considered to be unacceptable. It was always something very important. For instance, she might say, that guy in that second match there was wearing wrestling trunks that were too tight. They revealed too much of his private parts. So this lady was all up in this stuff here. Very important stuff like that is what Ole would discuss with her, apparently.
Wow.
Yeah. So prior to that, there were no restrictions on anything other than the fact that they didn't want any blood. Even so, we did have blood once in a while, and that usually got me a meeting with Ted Turner, no doubt. So if you ever want to talk to Ted Turner, all you had to do was bleed on TV, apparently. So.
Wow. Does he go into detail about the meetings with Turner?
No, not in this part of the book anyway. I'm sure at some point in there's got to be conversations he had with Ted, but it doesn't really play into any of this at this point anyway. I'm sure something's going to come up here when we get to the part where everything goes awry and Vince takes over.
Right. Well, I know what he could have told Turner was that, hey, Ted, accidents happen. That wasn't planned or whatever. He could at least say that. I mean,
right.
But yeah, I'm sure he had a way of dealing with it. He knew the amount of goodwill that the wrestling company had with Turner. He had a lot of leeway to play with.
And apparently it's at this point, Ole said when they were running Ohio, that he noticed Vince McMahon began raiding their television. And I guess he's talking in reference to taking over their TV slots. And I know Vince did that. And, and obviously he was starting to expand himself. And Ole talks about I remember in the book here, I don't have it in my notes, but Ole talks about Vince offering to pay the TV stations $2,000 per week, which is just, remember, Ole was telling Cleveland, I'll pay you guys $500 every time we run the arena for Channel 61. That's, I think they ran Cleveland, every 3 weeks? Even if it was every 2 weeks, that's $1,000 a month, let's say. Vince is offering to give them $8,000 a month. And you can't compete with anything like that. And that's kind of what starts it there in the syndicated markets. Right.
Well, in a previous episode, when it was Global Championship Wrestling, when Dr. Red Roberts and I went up to talk to the program director at Channel 44 in St. Pete, we ran into that. We were offering our show with not paying them anything, but allowing them to take the commercial time of 12 minutes per show and sell that commercial time. That would be their payment for, and the guy brought out that Turner had 2 hours on every week, and they were $4,000 each, I think. I think that's what he said. But anyways, something a heck of a lot more than we were offering. We weren't offering any positive money. So, yeah, I ran into that. And I only tell a story to say how defeating and deflating that is to deal with. What are you going to do, matches? He couldn't. Well, he probably could have afforded to if it meant keeping Cleveland. So he's paying $8,000 a month, but he's going in there. Well, he'd still be turning a profit, but he probably didn't want to start a precedent of paying these TV people because word gets around real quick.
Well, yeah, if you do that in one city, then you got to do it in another city, and eventually it's very counterproductive to making any kind of income out of this whole thing. And Vince has got the money, the capital to play with when he's doing that. And Ole said the whole entire situation started in Cincinnati, Ohio. That was the first TV station that Vince took from Georgia Championship Wrestling. He said Vince called in, Ole had it on authority, that Vince called in and said, "We're the WWF wrestling organization out of New York." And the station manager perked right up when he heard that, the words New York City. "We have a wrestling program that's much more exciting to you than Georgia Championship Wrestling. You probably already know about it, but if you don't, we thought we'd let you know that Georgia will no longer be booking their shows in the Riverfront Coliseum." So it sounds to me like Vince didn't just take the TV station, he took the building away. He took the lease away from Ole at the big arena.
Well, it sounds like it, doesn't it? Well, when he talks, that was one thing that.
I mean, that's business. I mean, at the end of the day, whether people like it or not.
Yeah, it is, and that Ole admits that himself in his dealings with McMahon. When McMahon wanted to shake hands with him, and they're meeting in Atlanta, and he just said, "Hey, it's just business, Ole." It's true. Now, it's just business. You're trying to steal my company here,
right?
But think about it. That's how Ole got it. Was by, rounding up enough stockholders to vote Barnett out and to put him in a situation where he was the one to be able to collect that money for several years. And the fact that it happened to him, while, certainly, a big deal, you go from having your hands on the money first to not having it at all. That would be a major shift, but I don't think Ole was prepared to go and start paying for all these TVs.
Oh, absolutely not. And that's another thing Ole points out here right around this point, if I remember correctly in the book, is that even if they hadn't gotten the Riverfront Coliseum, Vince McMahon was still offering to pay Cincinnati, the station, $2,000 a week versus the $500 you might run Cincinnati once a month that Ole was going to give them. And so as Ole put in his book, $2,000 is better than no grand, or $500 in this instance. So they were going to take Vince's offer no matter what, especially given their track record, being from New York, being Madison Square Garden, et cetera, et cetera. So he was doomed from the beginning in this instance. And it was really just a matter of time as Vince slowly started to pick apart some of the other towns. Ole says, "In my opinion, the WWF made the deals they never intended to fulfill. They would come in later and say, 'Gee whiz, we think $2,000 is a little more than we can afford. We just can't justify it.'" So kind of brilliant on Vince's part. He makes the phone call and he says, "We'll give you $2,000 a week, pal, if you take us." And they say, "Okay, we'll do it." And by the time we get to the contracts, after they've already ousted Ole from the TV station, maybe about $1,500. We can do that instead. How about that? That's a little bit much. And they're still going to take the 15, but the $2,000 sounded better, right? Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not saying Vince still didn't pay them more than Ole, but I am saying that, obviously he highballed them.
Right. Well, the thing is, once your competition is gone and out of business, you have a way of approaching people like the TV stations and saying, there's not anybody else looking for your services. We're the only company in town, and we do feel that 1,500 is too much. How about the 1,000 or 500 or whatever?
And by that point, Ole's long gone. George is long gone. So you got to take it for what it is.
Oh, yeah. Well, at one time, I mean, the NWA, and even when they tried to get together with Vern Gagne, for example, they could never come to terms about if they were going to get a group with Fritz and Vern and Ole and Bill Watts and all that. They could never determine who was going to lead it, who was going to be in charge, because they all wanted to be in charge. They just never could come to any kind of agreement, and they all ended up with their own companies being, put out of business because they couldn't agree. It's like, well, I've got right now, or I'm used to having the whole pie to myself. Now McMahon's coming in; he's looking like he wants to take my whole pie, and if things go according to what they look like they're going now, he's going to be able to do that. But now, if we get together and us four promoters work together, then we all get a quarter of a pie, and we're going to be making less money, but we can stay in business. Well, that would make sense, but obviously you're dealing with egos, and nobody wanted to be. Let's put it this way: they were used to unlimited power. Nobody wanted to back off and give up any of it, so they just couldn't. Well, Bill Watts. Ole told a story of Watts and Gagne moved the furniture out of whatever hotel they were in. Sure. Moved the furniture out of the living room and it had a carpet on it or something, and got down and wrestled. They got in an argument about something, and so they had a wrestling match. I mean, they weren't punching or anything, but or maybe they were, but I don't know. So you got guys that are
talk about too much testosterone, man. Millionaires down wrestling. I'm right. Yeah. No, I'm right. Well, let's wrestle. Well, that'll settle who's right. That makes sense.
Yeah. It's hard to do business with people who, again, if you've had unlimited access, and you're going to still have some sway, but it's going to be like 1/4 of what you had. Is that okay? And the money's going to be less than that probably, but at least you'll still be in business. No, they didn't want to hear that. I don't know what they expected to happen, but hindsight's always 20/20. You can look back now and say, "Oh, I should have done this, should have done that." But I don't know. I've always admired Ole, and I like the part too where he admitted that his way of dealing with McMahon wasn't the best. That he could have probably done better if he'd been less aggressively hostile. I mean, later on, he's
right.
I think he was talking about hindsight. Again, when you're used to being in charge, and Ole was a millionaire for real.
Yeah.
He did have the money and the assets. He didn't just have money and stock. He had property and things that were real assets. They're tangible assets. Mm-hmm. With his sawmill and everything else, he had a business, and he had bought property for lumber.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to cover one more excerpt here this week, and we'll wrap it up because it's going to set the stage for the entire Vince McMahon takeover and everything, which is going to be fun in itself, and definitely going to get your memories of everything that was going on, best you can recall at that point in time next time around. But this is basically how the whole thing works in regards to TV, and how obviously Vince doesn't have TBS yet, but he's slowly taking some of the other towns away. And it's very brilliant, honestly, when you listen to what Ole says next. He said, "We did not have contracts with the TV stations." That's interesting. He said, "Sometimes we had a handshake deal, but for the most part, it was only to provide them with a TV show. There was nothing binding. The station could do whatever they wanted to do. Up to that point, that arrangement worked for us well because we could do whatever we wanted to do also. As long as we provided a TV show, they promised to put it on the air. Let's face it, we didn't have any contracts, so what were we going to do? Go after the TV station? Hey, we had a verbal agreement and you gave our time to Vince." The TV station would reply, "That's right. Now what do you do?" Apparently nothing. I guess a good point there. He said, "Then Vince's people went to the other arenas and the other TV stations and said, I don't know if you've heard yet, but Georgia Championship Wrestling just lost its TV contract with Channel 11. Call the station and verify it. When they called the station personnel would say, yeah, we have the WWF show now. The WWF people would then say, we know you have shows booked in the upcoming months. That was true. We booked as much as a year ahead. We'll be more than willing to take those over from you, Ole. Whatever deal you have with Georgia Championship Wrestling, we'll do better, Vince is telling the arenas. So basically it started with Cincinnati, and then they started calling some of the other cities and saying, hey, call Cincy, ask them. Georgia's out. We're the in thing. Use us. And then they called to verify, and sure enough, it's true. They've lost the Coliseum. They've lost the TV station. And now, well, I'm going to follow in their suit. I'm not going to let Cincinnati outdo me up here in say, Cleveland or Toledo or wherever. And so it begins. And this is how it begins.
Wow. Oh, man, I think of the pressure on Ole and all those guys. But,
oh, my God, yeah.
I mean, I don't have any animus towards any of them, but I liked Ole personally. But you know what? I mean, it wasn't a tragedy. He made millions of dollars while he was there. Mm-hmm. How can you look at that as being
failure? It's not a failure. It's just, it was over. The party was over.
Right. And he was lucky. Well, it wasn't luck. I mean, he knew where he wanted to go and he went there. That was the thing I admired about him his whole career. He had a purpose and aim of going to the top where and being the top worker, not to knock anybody, it's not a knock, but even to be a Ric Flair, where you're a champion for 10 years or whatever, and you're getting that main event payoff every night for all that time. Ole still made more money in a couple of years than the champion would have made maybe 10, with being able to take, not just a salary, but money up. I don't know how much money. I'm not saying Ole stole any money. I'm sure he could pay himself whatever he wanted. At least when I was there wasn't anybody checking on him. At least they weren't coming to the office to do it, because I never saw about anybody in there with a team of accountants behind them. But yeah, it was the end of the free lunch as far as the local promoters were going, wasn't it?
Yeah. And, we'll talk a little bit more about that at the top of the next program. Some of the other promoters that Vince starts to take over their towns. And then the NWA promoters meeting in 1983, Ole stands up and has some things to say about Vince Jr., but Vince Sr. is in attendance. And we're going to talk about what Vince Sr. had to say to Ole after Ole basically bashed Vince Jr. there on the microphone at the meeting. And then from there, we're going to hear what happens when Ole is offered the chance to go up to the hotel room where Vinny Jr., who was too smart to be part of this NWA promoters meeting, by the way, he was waiting. And we'll see if Ole accepts that request, what he does with that. Also, Ole speculates that Vince Jr. may have been making some phone calls when Georgia Championship Wrestling was in town. It seems like Vince got wind of some of the guys who had issues, we'll say, perhaps some drug issues, and turned the local police on to certain talent to have them searched. And it's some crazy stuff we got going on. And that's all to set up what's to come here, guys. Black Saturday, 1984, of course, when Vince McMahon takes over Georgia Championship Wrestling, takes over WTBS, and all of that's still to come. We're going to get your insight on that. And once we get all the story played out between Vince and Jim Barnett and Ole and you and being involved and getting to see some of this firsthand, then we get to go back, reset, and talk about your career here in Georgia and all of the great talent that was here during this time period.
Wow, that sounds great. What you just mentioned, I was with Jake the Snake and I. We flew in one of the times we flew into Ohio from Atlanta to start our tour up in Ohio and Michigan. We got off the plane. He had some cops waiting for him, and they took him. And I went and got the rental car, and I was waiting for him. And eventually he came out, and they let him go. I said, "Well, you weren't carrying anything then, I guess, huh?" And he said, "Well, I don't know." He showed me he had a carry-all thing, a bag, like a shopping bag, but it was kind of fancy. He had some string support and everything, and he had some, I don't know, books and some stuff in there. It was just like a convenient carry-all, and he showed it to me, and he turned it around, and on one side of it, there was this lump of a little bag, a little lump sticking out. What it was an eighth of a gram of cocaine, that an 8-ball that he had it there the whole time, and they never found it. So, in fact,
Lucky him.
He did it all that night, I believe.
I'm so sure he did. He did all of that in an hour or two, I'm sure.
Yeah, he invited all the coke heads over. He wanted to get rid of it in case they followed up and busted his hotel room. He got rid of it all that night. He had a coke party. And
well, I'm glad you shared that story, because there's actually a second story Ole has here with Jake as well that happens in Atlanta due to this. And Buzz Sawyer also going to they're going to try to crack Buzz Sawyer. We're going to have Ole's response to all of that and more next time here on the show. So I'm glad you shared that with us. A little teaser for next time, guys.
Yeah. And I want to say something before we part ways.
Sure.
To our friends out there. Bear with me. I mean, I normally am kind of erratic in terms of staying with the person directing this whole entire program is Ray Russell. That's the person who's keeping us on the straight and narrow. And I usually refuse to stay there. But today I'm even worse because I'm a little under the weather. I've got a problem with my lungs, and if I croak, I want you to know that I've enjoyed being with you, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to get as much of my life out while I'm still with it. But I don't plan on it happening, but you never know. But I have been kind of erratic today, and I tell you what I mean. I start a train of thought, and by the time I get halfway down the line, I've forgotten where I'm going and to what depot I'm heading for, and I just kind of trail off. And I apologize for that. But
well, I think you held your own today. You were able to. You fooled me. I mean, I know you're not doing 100% perfect right now and everything, but I'm happy you were able to make it through. We pumped out another show, and we got more fun stories out there, and reliving the glory days of wrestling. Maybe not so glory days for some people like Jim Barnett, my boy, but it's definitely a fun era to go back and kind of dissect from a different perspective, not just sitting here and telling memories and stories of things, but being able to go back and looking at it's a history lesson in wrestling for anybody who's interested in it, obviously, and to get your take and your memories and your thoughts and whatnot. That's certainly helpful because you were there, you knew these people.
Right. Think about this. What we're talking about affects the history of the wrestling business. If McMahon hadn't been able to get TBS for a while and expand his product and also get rid of the competition or at least diminish it for a while, he wouldn't have had the ability maybe to promote people like Hulk Hogan like he did. So the face of the business changed as a result of what we're talking about today and have been talking about and will continue to talk about. It changes to from what happened to where the business got to, and we're going to get into more of that in the future.
Oh, absolutely. We got a ton coming, guys, so stay tuned for that. I want to thank you again, Bob, for doing it this week. We'll be back next week, another episode of the Wrestling Stoop right around the corner. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, folks, for being with us.